Yoshitoki Oima's A Silent Voice is a story about a young boy named Shoya Ishida who meets a deaf girl named Shoko Nishimiya at school and at first hates her. Despite her efforts to be friendly, he and his friends bully her relentlessly. Finally, Shoya gets in trouble for his actions and his friends turn on him. Shoko transfers schools to someplace safer, and Shoya continues to be bullied. Shoya decides to learn sign language as a way to say sorry to Shoko for what he has done. We follow him as he learns to repent and live again despite his past. My name is Wellington Tremaine, and I am your host. Today, we are going to be looking at a silent voice in terms of linguistics and linguistic philosophy, exploring the themes of the story as well as the evolution of sign language itself. Welcome to the podcast. Now, perhaps it seems strange at first to focus on linguistic philosophy when our primary concern is sign language. As Hornsby 2014 points out, linguistics is primarily a study of the spoken word. While written texts are sometimes the concern of the linguist, generally linguists follow the principle of according primacy to speech, primarily because all the world's existing and extinct natural languages have had native speakers, but only a minority of them have ever had a written form. The primacy of speech is thus entrenched in the study of linguistics. For example, Andre Martinet, 1960, states that one of the basic assumptions of structuralist approaches to linguistics is that nothing may be called linguistic that is not manifest or manifested one way or another between the mouth of the speaker and the ears of the listener. What we want for sign language, then, is for it to be seen as a real kind of speech, with a clear internal structure. And this is how scholars of the subject treat it today. Indeed, the language we use to talk about sign language came from terms that were developed for the analysis of spoken languages. Sign language seems to bridge the gap between the spoken and the written, however, given its use of space and signs. This is unique to sign language, though it is not a reason for sign language to lack a written form. Many languages in history have lacked a written system, such as the Gaulish language, which was spoken in France before Roman occupation. Sign language, however, does have written systems that are either in use or have been attempted in the past. Sign language is very much a part of the study of linguistics because signing is inherently verbal, and we are going to treat it that way. After all, the English translation of the anime's title is A Silent Voice. So, where does linguistic philosophy or philosophy of linguistics begin and linguistics end? Linguistics is the scientific study of language, while philosophy of linguistics analyzes the scientific inquiry of linguistics. Mackenzie, 1997, perhaps says it best in the introduction to his book, Introduction to Linguistic Philosophy, when he writes, Linguistics is the empirical study of natural languages. Philosophy of language is concerned with the underlying nature of the phenomena that linguists study. And linguistic philosophy is an approach to the philosophy of language. This approach is perhaps exemplified best by Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, which stresses the importance of always seeing how language is used rather than assuming it to conform to some pre-existing logical structure. Primary philosophers working in the linguistic field are Wittgenstein, Frege, Carnap, Russell, Quine, and Chomsky. Schultz 2024 explains that general topics of the first type in the philosophy of linguistics include what the subject matter is, what the theoretical goals are, what form theories should take, and what counts as data. Schultz explains that there are, in general, three basic approaches to language in linguistic philosophy: externalism, emergentism, and essentialism. These titles are not descriptive, but rather mnemonic tags, and we will be exploring all of them later in the episode. But first, a few words about sign language and the anime. It has taken sign language a long time to be taken seriously. Indeed, Japanese Sign Language, also called Nihon Shuwa, has only just recently been named a real language as of 2025, after 20 years of advocacy and 5 years spent specifically pushing for the Japanese Sign Language Act. JSL is not alone in the struggle, as Margalit Fox explained in her book Talking Hands, 2007. Sign languages are absolutely individual languages, though history has treated them otherwise. Signs prior to the ASL tradition were believed to be no more than gross holistic gestures, which stood for English words, mostly everyday nouns, in a one-to-one correspondence. They appeared to lack the complex internal structure of the words of spoken language. Additionally, signed sentences were thought to have no grammar. But as Wool 2019 writes, sign languages are natural languages which arise from deaf community. They are not related to or derived from spoken languages. They use the visual spatial modality, and they do indeed have their own lexicons and grammars. Despite this, non-signers have attempted to control the use of sign languages. For example, considering the facial movements that go into signing grotesque and insisting that signers must stop. Fox 2007 quotes Oliver Sacks as saying, "Signing had been seen up to this time as something without internal structure or coherence or rules, something far below the level of language." Deaf people were made to feel ashamed about signing, given that American Sign Language, before it was considered ASL, was seen as inferior. And this attitude has been maintained across various cultures, treating signed languages as bastardizations of verbal languages. There is even a moment in the manga of A Silent Voice where Shoko's mother tells everyone at the dinner table not to sign because, quote, "it's indecent and bad manners." This is not included in the film. As Wall 2019 writes, there is a long history of punishing deaf people for signing. Quote, "I had a lot of punishments for signing in classrooms and at playground. Then one morning at assembly I was caught again, then ordered to stand in front. The headmistress announced that I looked like a monkey, waving my hands everywhere. She said she will put me in a cage in the zoo so the people will laugh at a stupid boy in the cage." Also, in keeping with general preconceptions of how deafness used to be viewed, in the Silent Voice manga there is a flashback segment where Shoko's mother is arguing with her then husband and his family members, and they say that Shoko or her mother must have done something terrible in a previous life for Shoko to be born deaf. Shoko's deafness is karma. As Karen Nakamura 2006 writes, this has a connection in Japan to Buddhism. The teachings of many Buddhist sects in Japan suggest that physical impairment in a lifetime may be the result of bad karma in a previous lifetime. Pronouncements include: karma from a past life will cause one to be born deaf and mute. The wife of the man who violates the Lotus Sutra shall bear a child who is mute. If a woman violates the Lotus Sutra, her child will follow a similar fate. In a collection of Buddhist tales collected by the monk Keikai, 12 of the stories mention individuals who are deaf, blind, or otherwise disabled. All 12 stories also associate this disability with past sins. One additional note I'd like to add is that it is considered courteous in JSL to tap someone on the shoulder in order to get that person's attention. This happens a lot in A Silent Voice, which I thought was a nice touch, even though many of the characters don't know much about sign language. To quote the Wikipedia for JSL, there are 304,000 deaf and hard of hearing people who are above age 18 in Japan as of 2008. However, there is no specific source about the number of JSL users because of the difficulty in distinguishing who are JSL users and who use other kinds of sign, like Sign Japanese and Pidgin Sign Japanese. According to the Japanese Association for Sign Language Studies, the estimated number of JSL users is around 60,000 in Japan. To refer to Nakamura 2006, most deaf children are born to hearing parents, meaning that sign languages often form around schools for the deaf. Consequently, students at different schools may use different forms, even in the same city. Nakamura uses the example of anthropologist Barbara Lee Master 2003, who discusses two Catholic schools for the deaf in Ireland in the same city, where two different signing forms developed. Because the schools were segregated by gender, the language variation also carried over to the adult population, with men signing differently from women. Other scholars have found variance among older black and white signers in the United States too because of racial segregation. Naturally, this implies that even within JSL there are distinct differences in signing across Japan. For example, gestural variants exist for some, though not all, cardinal numbers, such as the regional differences of the sign for 10. Some signers from the Kansai and Hokkaido prefectures use a different variant to those from other areas. Moreover, 11 has at least three different variants which seem to pattern according to age rather than region, with the second variant used by younger signers and the third variant used by older signers. Such differences do not account for the various accents or idiolects that signing persons may have. Just like in spoken word languages, people have unique ways of communicating. Despite these other versions of sign language, JSL is used in a silent voice. Among the material I consulted in writing this episode, two of my sources were videos explaining the JSL of A Silent Voice, which you can find in the bibliography, basically going through the movie and illustrating the way in which the language appears throughout the story. The movie follows JSL completely, revealing that the author has explicit knowledge of how JSL works. The primary theme of the story is communication and how difficult it can be at times. As Oima explained in an interview, the original title in Japanese translates to Shape of a Voice, and when I chose that title, I meant for it to express that this is a story about communication itself. At the end of the day, Shoko's hearing impairment is only one aspect of her, and the bullying in this story is one of the outcomes of miscommunication. A key example is when Shoko decides to confess her love for Shoya, and she attempts to speak despite her deaf accent, shouting, "I love Mu," instead of "I love you." There is a breakdown in communication here, Shoya misunderstanding her as saying, "I love the moon," which alludes to the title of the story. Indeed, Shoko's voice has a particular shape, both when she is talking using her voice and signing, one which others might not understand or make fun of. Thus, the story is about finding a way to communicate, working through these issues, and finding common ground. So you can imagine why I thought this would be a great anime to explore linguistic philosophy, particularly because we have someone on YouTube who we can consult who actually goes through various JSL statements that appear in the movie. So, a little bit about linguistic philosophy. Linguistic philosophy has its origins in the influence of logic on philosophy, which, as Scruton 2005 explains, is thanks to Frege. Weismann 1965 explains that the development owes its birth to a switch in ignoring answers and directing attention towards the questions of philosophy. Without many being aware of it, logic was advanced by mathematicians into an instrument which exceeded the logic of the schools of philosophy in, quote, delicacy and expressive power. As Frege remarked in his Begriffsschrift, logic would one day be of use to philosophy in the task of breaking the tyranny of words over thought by bringing to light the confusions which are almost unavoidable in the use of language. The use of logic unlocked meaning obfuscated by the terrain of language, to the point that, quote, the new analytic method leads us to the view that the questions of philosophy themselves rest upon misunderstandings. It frees us from them by making the meaning of our words and the way they are combined in language so clear that we no longer feel driven to ask the questions. The study of language brings forth a key observation which illuminates the fact that individual perception is the only real way to understand the world. Quote, the idealist knows the shock of realizing for the first time that the world is merely an idea in his mind, that he knows neither a sun nor an earth, but only an eye that sees the sun, a hand that feels an earth, to quote Schopenhauer. Does anything, then, exist besides individual consciousness? Kant must have felt this sort of thing when the existence of mathematics suddenly became a riddle to him. How is it possible, he thought, that geometry, which is independent of all experience, should agree so miraculously with reality? Can mind, without the assistance of experience, fathom the properties of real things by mere cogitation? It is from this unique perspective that language is encountered and processed, and at times fashioned. This is the starting point of philosophy of linguistics, for it is here that we stumble upon the problem of clarity. What is the true definition of a word? Can any word truly be defined? What is meaning? What do we mean when we say that someone is unclear about something? For example, how do we define the word true and its forms such as truthful and truth? What is a grammar? As Neft 2025 explains, philosophy of linguistics is an approach to these questions and more from the perspective of the philosophy of science. Linguistics itself is a formal science akin to logic or mathematics, and so the natural evolution of the philosophy of linguistics makes sense. A dominant approach in the philosophy of linguistics views linguistics as a cognitive science. In fact, it was the arrival of the formal and computational revolution in cognitive science that entrenched linguistics as both scientifically and philosophically appealing. A core character in this development was Chomsky, who, again, according to Neft 2025, set the philosophico-linguistic agenda, particularly through the discovery of generative grammar. Harris 2021 also quotes him as being called the Einstein of linguistics. Now, generative grammar includes various areas of linguistics such as semantics, syntax, phonology, among others, and most theories work like this, having influence in various specializations or studies within linguistics or philosophy of linguistics. So it's a good example of how this works. So now let's talk about the various general approaches to linguistics that I mentioned earlier: externalism, emergentism, and essentialism. To start, externalists believe that the main goal of linguistic theory is to use corpora, which is their word for linguistic datasets, to develop accurate models of the structural properties of speech sounds, words, phrases, and other linguistic items. They identify a system of patterns from these actual utterances, and from there can predict cases previously unconsidered. Externalists are generally structuralists. So if you listen to the ergo proxy episodes, I talked about two very prominent structuralists, Saussure and Levi-Strauss, so I won't go into them here. But basically, early linguists were collecting a lot of data on languages, but really weren't sure what to do with that information. 1786 is generally regarded as the birth date of linguistics, and this is where people started comparing the structural similarities of various languages and attempting to organize their elements to prove that they had a common ancestor. There was a shift in the late 19th, early 20th centuries from the historical recording of language changes to seeing language as a self-contained and structured system situated at a particular point in time. And so this is where you get this approach to language. A primary figure in this group was Leonard Bloomfield, who would be largely rejected by interpretive and generative semanticists by the mid 1960s. Emergentists, meanwhile, understand linguistics in terms of the human capacity to construct meaningful communication. That is, language is something produced by individual cognitive processes and therefore by culture. Language is an inherently social animal, and so the goal of the emergentists, people like Edward Sapir, was or is to explore the cognitive, cultural, historical, and evolutionary explanations of phenomena found in linguistic communication systems. So, using Sapir as an example, in his work we see a blending of anthropology and linguistics as well as a smattering of psychology because he believed that there was a clear relationship between the disciplines. He understood the importance of the human element to languages. Emergentists additionally generally believe that linguistic form is not autonomous, meaning that things like syntax and pragmatics are inherently linked. Finally, we have essentialism. The goal of the essentialist is to identify universal principles of linguistic structure, that is, principles that are subconsciously known, intrinsic to language. The idea is that children have an innate ability to pick up language, and that this means that there are certain principles that allow children to acquire language to a master level. Chomsky falls into the essentialist school because of his work in generative grammar and the theoretical work that went into establishing what he calls I language. I language being, quote, an internal, individual, intentional mental brain state of an individual language cognizer. Cognizer meaning the person or brain that is doing the cognizing. Internal means internal to the language user or intracranial. Individual pertains to the fact that one's grammar is not something that relates to facts outside of the individual speaker. And intentional marks the functional or generative procedure for accessing expressions of a language, as opposed to the external set containing all such expressions. The essentialist position is one that dominates the history of philosophy of linguistics, given that it leads to an event known as the Linguistics Wars. A debate over a single principle in Chomskyan linguistics resulted in a division in the camp, one side becoming called the interpretive semanticists and the other side becoming called generative semanticists. And this is where we get the rejection of Bloomfield, though one side did evolve to support aspects suggested by pre-Chomskyan linguists. So, because of the importance of Chomsky to the history of linguistics, I intend to analyze as much as I can. Uh, there's a lot that goes into it. I won't be getting too deep into the mess, but the sign language of a silent voice through generative transformational syntax. To do this, I will be focusing on his very important essay, Syntactic Structures. This particular book is beloved by computer scientists for its mathematical theorizing of language, in which language is conceived as a string of symbols divorced from meaning. In short, language is a purely mechanical system for manipulating symbols. According to David Lightfoot, syntactic structures was the snowball that started the avalanche of the modern cognitive revolution, allowing us unique insight on areas of study such as AI. The idea was that sentences derive from underlying structures, some of which they share with other sentences. Essentially, we can map out sentences hierarchically, explaining their syntactic details by constructing diagrams as visual representations of syntactic rules. And in this way, we can identify the deep structure of language, which, by the way, disappears as an explanation for language when we get into the minimalist program, which was also influenced by Chomsky. But because syntactic structures is so important, I want to use it to analyze the sign language of a silent voice, JSL. Because it rejects the notion that language is about meaning or communication, it will provide us a unique approach to a silent voice, which, as I mentioned, is literally all about communication. Chomsky literally says that there is little evidence that intuition about meaning is at all useful to the actual investigation of linguistic form. Following syntactic structures, there were a lot of developments that occurred based on Chomsky's work, particularly with the increase of researchers. Linguists across the United States were becoming transformationalists, and this is where we get Lakoff from Indiana, who I will not be discussing. In short, transformational grammar was groundbreaking, finally making its way internationally. Research diversified from English and started to be developed around other languages. I finally found work done on both Chomsky and sign languages, a revised version submitted for the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Chomsky in 2020. So let's talk a little bit about what this study says. Chomsky's revolution and the revolution in sign language linguistics began around the same time, but they did not directly affect each other for a while. But eventually they converged. William Stuckey, who heavily aided the general understanding of sign language in the United States, was not enthusiastic about the application of sign language to generative grammar and purportedly never warmed up to it. Ursula Belugi and Edward S. Klima did work on Stuckey's research and were influenced by generative grammar. They were interested in understanding the linguistic rules underlying ASL, which they approached through analysis of data from native signers, psycholinguistics, acquisition, and studies of breakdown in signers with aphasia. While their work is very compatible with generative ideas, their focus in ASL analysis was not on specific generative mechanisms. Other scholars mentored by Belugi and Klima, however, did ample work in that area. It is generally understood that numerous scholars adopted the assumption that specific proposals made within the generative tradition ought to apply to sign languages as well as spoken languages from as early as the 1970s. For example, Susan D. Fisher wrote what is considered the first generative syntactic analysis of a sign language, specifically ASL. Another early work was produced by Scott K. Little, which also talks about ASL. In my research, I came across Masayoshi Shibutani's Japanese Generative Grammar, published in 1976, which focuses on the application of generative grammar to the Japanese language. I have yet to locate a text that analyzes JSL through generative grammar. In syntactic structures, Chomsky is concerned with defining a grammar based around how people actually use language. He defines language, quote, as a set of finite or infinite sentences, each finite in length and constructed out of a finite set of elements. Each natural language has a finite number of phonemes, which are basically the sounds of the alphabet, sounds in a language that are distinguishable from one another. And each sentence is representable as a finite sequence of these phonemes, though there are infinitely many sentences. He says that the goal of linguistic analysis is to separate the grammatical from the ungrammatical and to study the structure of grammatical sequences. The grammar of a language will thus be a device that generates all of the grammatical sequences of L for language and none of the ungrammatical ones. A grammar must necessarily be finite. It cannot just be a list of morphemes because there is an infinite number of morphemes, which are the smallest meaningful unit of a language, as opposed to phonemes, which are merely sounds. Beginning chapter 3, Chomsky asks what sort of device can produce a set of grammatical sentences of English. He assumes that each sentence of this set can be thought of as a sequence of phonemes of finite length, and for this reason, among others, linguistic description proceeds in terms of a system of levels of representations. Instead of stating the phonemic structure of sentences directly, the linguist sets up such higher level elements as morphemes, and states separately the morphemic structure of sentences and the phonemic structure of morphemes. Morphemes are considered higher level, obviously, because they hold meaning. To explain this further and simpler, sentences are composed of morphemes, and morphemes contain phonemes. Words can contain more than one morpheme, e.g., blueberry. But although phonemes and morphemes are conceptually distinct, there are cases where phonemes can function as morphemes. In other words, a sound unit can be meaningless from the phonological point of view, but meaningful from the morphosyntactic point of view. It is easier to look at these two levels of description than to tackle a direct description of the phonemic structure of sentences. Chomsky suggests a machine that can escape the problem of a grammar being finite. Quote, suppose we have a machine that can be in any one of a finite number of different internal states, and suppose that this machine switches from one state to another by producing a certain symbol, such as an English word. One of these states is an initial state, and one of these is a final state. The initial state leads to the final state by generating a sequence of words, and thus the machine creates a sentence. In the field's parlance, a string of words that is either accepted or rejected by the machine. The machine is called a finite state grammar. Chomsky provides a box diagram complete with arrows starting with an arrow labeled the, leading to the box which has the words man comes and men come on opposing sides. By adding a loop at the beginning of the box, one inserts the word old. This loop means that the word old can be repeated an infinite number of times. Chomsky suggests that a human who uses language can be considered this machine, a machine that recognizes a regular language. Quote, in producing a sentence, the speaker begins in this initial state, produces the first word of the sentence, thereby switching into a second state which limits the choice of the second word, etc. This is the Markov process. Each state through which he passes represents the grammatical restrictions that limit the choice of the next word at this point in the utterance. He suggests this because his version of modality is that human language is hierarchical and recursive. However, Chomsky comes to the conclusion that English is not a finite state language, meaning that this diagram cannot be replicated for analyzing the English language because the model is insufficient. Is JSL the same? Assumingly yes, because it is a complex language and cannot be described as a finite grammar. As we have established, JSL is indeed a real language, not built to merely mimic the Japanese language. Chomsky explains that Markov process models cannot explain or account for a speaker's ability to produce and understand new utterances in English. Presumably, other languages function similarly insofar as it is impossible to construct a device that will produce all and only the grammatical sentences of any language. Chomsky goes on to reject the conception of grammar as finite state. He says specifically that a finite state grammar is the simplest type of grammar, which, with a finite amount of apparatus, can generate an infinite number of sentences. We consequently must seek a more powerful type of grammar and some more abstract form of linguistic theory. We are seeking a natural language. Chomsky adds that the notion of linguistic level of representation must be modified and elaborated. At least one linguistic level cannot have the finite state structure. There is also not a finite set of levels. To generate a non-finite state language such as English, or in our case JSL, we need fundamentally different methods and a more general concept of linguistic level. In an interview with Mitsu Ronat in the 1998 Noam Chomsky in the Bibliography, Noam Chomsky said that finite state Markov sources were supposed as appropriate for the description of language around the end of the 1940s. Roman Jakobson referred to this vaguely, but Charles F. Hockett utilized them explicitly. In 1955, he proposed a theory of language structure based on a Markov source model borrowed from the mathematical theory of communication. Similar theories were developed by psychologists, engineers, and mathematicians. Chomsky was skeptical of these developments and wanted to prove that these models were not appropriate for the grammar of a natural language. Syntactic structures is a valiant attempt at this. Beginning chapter 4, Chomsky says that linguistic description on the syntactic level is formulated in terms of constituent analysis, in other words, parsing. And that is what he does here, listing out the parts of the sentence, "the man hit the ball," as an example. Instead of initially mapping the sentence out using a tree diagram, Chomsky lines up the parts of the sentence hierarchically in two steps. In example 13, he gives the rules. In 14, he produces the sentence. S stands for sentence, NP stands for noun phrase, VP stands for verb phrase, T stands for the, and then N and V stand for noun and verb, respectively. 13 establishes that S equals NP plus VP, NP equals T plus N, VP equals V plus NP, T equals the, N equals man, ball, etc., and verb equals hit, took, etc. Then in example 14, we get the sentence mapped out. 1. NP plus VP. 2. The plus N plus VP. 3. The plus N plus V plus NP. And then each following iteration slowly transforms into the terminal sentence, "the man hit the ball," without the labels for constituent analysis. He calls these strings later on, similar to those involved with the finite state machines, when he explains that 14 is a derivation, which is defined as a finite sequence of strings. The letter sigma represents the finite set of initial strings and the application of these strings as they evolve in accordance with the formula rewrite x as y, following the instruction formulas of f. Certain derivations as such are considered terminated derivations in the sense that their final string cannot be rewritten any further by the rules f. Thus 14 is a terminated derivation, but the sequence consisting of the first 5 lines of 14 is not. Grammars that have terminal strings, Chomsky thinks, describe languages, because if we have a terminal language and its grammar, we can reconstruct the phrase structure of each sentence of the language. Thus we can describe that language. Chomsky's vision for deep structure, then, is to move from the structural to the literal sentence structure so we see the internal levels of any given sentence. Then Chomsky takes us back to finite state Markov processes while we are still considering terminal languages generated by systems of the form sigma and f. He establishes a theorem stating every finite state language is a terminal language, but there are terminal languages which are not finite state languages. He then sets about explaining himself and eventually pushes us into the generative transformational framework, and also says that some natural languages cannot be described this way at all. I think, however, that sign language is not the latter. Now let's get into the how and why using words and sentences that appear in a silent voice. So first, a few rules. Quoting Imizato directly, the syntax of JSL has not been fully described yet, so we need to be content with an analysis based on the limited research results currently available. Second, JSL may lack some of the syntactic categories devised for spoken languages. For example, in JSL, there is no discrete category of pre-postposition except the locative place and the pointing at a location sign that may possibly be recognized as a postposition-like element. These elements follow nouns. There are no genitives. We also have difficulty distinguishing adjectives from verbs. Descriptive adjectives like expressions or possibly relative clauses and numerals usually follow nouns, while a small number of restrictive adjective-like expressions precede the nouns. Third, signs that are articulated by various body parts, for example, both hands, mouth, face, head, often occur simultaneously with other signs. Non-manual adverbials, for example, facial expressions, almost always occur simultaneously with verb or adjective-like expression. There also exists manually articulated adverbs. Some of them, for example, always, can precede verbs, whereas others, for example, yet, follow verbs. Yes-no questions are differentiated from assertions by adding a question marker as a facial expression at the end of the sentence without any inversion of statement order. Subordinate verbal forms, for example, V plus purpose, tend to precede main verbs. Conditional clauses usually precede the conclusion. The inflected auxiliary verb, for example, auxiliary verb for subject-object marking, tends to follow the main verb. Comparison of superiority is not expressed by order of standard marker and adjective. Relative expressions follow the noun. Neither pronominal objects nor nominal objects follow the verb. Another thing that needs to be said before we get into the meat. Morphology and phonology both apply to sign languages, even though we often think of languages in the verbal form. I mentioned this a bit earlier, kind of setting us up to get here, so this wouldn't be some sort of shocker. Unlike spoken languages, there is no consonant-vowel distinction. Instead, there is an important distinction between manual and non-manual features, and so these serve as the phonemes of a given sign language. Now, what are these? Manual features are considered the following: hand shape, location, movement, orientation, and non-manual features are signals that essentially enhance the experience of reading, such as facial expressions, eyes, mouth, eyebrows, meaning that they function like intonation in spoken languages. Manual features are also called parameters, and all 5 of these have what are called primes. In ASL, for example, the handshape parameter has over 40 different handshape primes. One change in a parameter can completely change what is being said. For example, in ASL, the words apple and onion have the same handshape, palm orientation, and movement, but they have a different location which results in a different meaning. Sign language phonemes typically include location and orientation of the hand or hands, and a phoneme can become a morpheme when the sign signifies some meaning, such as the word color, as my source gives an example. The source is UPenn Linguistic Notes, by the way. In sign languages, sign phonemes are highly likely to function as sign morphemes. In spoken languages, phonemes functioning as morphemes are the exception rather than the rule. So obviously all of this is an issue when it comes to analyzing JSL in any way. Let's look at the signed sentence translated into Japanese, Doshite shuwa dekuru no, which in English means, why can you do sign language? It should be noted that JSL is heavily reliant on the Japanese writing system, and so it dedicates particular attention to the written language and includes elements specifically designed to express kanji in signs, so it makes sense to translate JSL into Japanese. This is the part in the story where Shoto meets Shoko for the first time since middle school, and she is shocked that he knows sign language. Shoko moves her right hand under her left in a sweeping motion back and forth, pointing her finger, then rotates her hands one around the other, finally pointing with her right hand to Shoto. Translating the Japanese consecutively into English, the sentence would look like why sign language can you, and no is present as a particle. In Japanese Sign Language, the Y comes first with the sweeping motion, and then sign language is signed by rotating the hands around each other. Obviously, Shoko also points to Shoto a second time, signifying you. This has to do with something I mentioned earlier, where I said that JSL has no specific category of pre-post position except the locative place, and then the pointing at a location sign that may be recognized as post-position like element, because as noted, the you follows the noun sign language. So if you wanted to map this out like Chomsky, it would be A for adverb, N for noun, P for pronoun, but basically the subject. Sentence equals A plus N plus P, meaning Y sign language you. The can of it all, which is a helper verb, is silently implied by context and facial expressions. Sign language is nonlinear in this way, which makes mapping such strings difficult. But we can be sure that this represents a non-kernel sentence for Chomsky, which I have not gone into yet, but basically, kernel sentences are sentences that are grammatically correct and cannot be reduced from their form without losing their meaning. Quote, then we define the kernel of the language in terms of grammar G as the set of sentences that are produced when we apply obligatory transformations to the terminal strings of the sigma F grammar. So an example that Chomsky gives in syntactic structures is John ate an apple. A transformation of this, hence the title Transformational Grammar as an extension of generative grammar, would be the interrogative sentence, did John eat an apple? So in the case of why can you do or speak sign language, the kernel sentence would be you can speak sign language. But also, let's consider what this means for phonemes and morphemes. So as our UPenn source points out, sign phonemes often function as sign morphemes, but not always. Let's look at the JSL word tomodachi, which in English means friend or friends, and appears in a silent voice early on. This shape is made by pointing at yourself, then at another person, then clasping your hands together. These combined gestures suggest me and you friends. The kanji for tomodachi is the character you and the character tachi, the latter of which is a suffix to indicate plurality. Following the International Phonetic Alphabet, tomodachi has 7 phonemes, none of which function as morphemes on their own. In JSL, we have 2 different hand shapes. Hand shape G, we have location stretching out from the chest to point. Orientation is closed palm. Movement is pointing from one person to the other. Then we have hand shape, presumably C, because the 2 hands are cupped, which is where the hands are brought close to the chest and clasped together. Presumably there is no movement to this hand shape, but in the anime, Shoko seems to move her clasped hands up and down slightly as if to provide emphasis, though later we see Shoto make the same sign for friend and move his clasped hands back and forth, signifying that on its own, friend involves this movement anyway. These elements, such as hand shape, are the phonemes of sign language. So what does Chomsky have to say about phonemes and syntactic structures? Throughout the transformational process from kernel sentences to non-kernel sentences, phonemes are largely ignored for most of that process. Remember that kernel sentences are simple, active, declarative, and affirmative sentences. To produce passive, negative, interrogative, or complex sentences, one or more optional transformation rules must be applied in a particular order to the kernel sentences, and that's quoting Wikipedia. At the final stage of the transformation, we translate everything into a string of phonemes using the morphophonemic rules of the grammar. Chomsky also says that we cannot define phonemic distinctness through meaning, and so it must be explained in completely non-semantic terms using a pair test. But what is a pair test? For Chomsky, it is a test that is done using 2 people or 1 person and a tape recorder. Suppose that a linguist wants to determine whether metal or medal are phonemically distinct. Instead of using meaning to define the difference, the linguist asks a person or 2 people to identify the difference through repetition. Quote, for example, he might make a random sequence of copies of the utterance tokens that interest him, and then determine whether or not the speaker can consistently identify them. If there is consistent identification, the linguist may apply an even stricter test, asking the speaker to repeat each word several times and running the pair test over again on the repetitions. If consistent distinguishability is maintained under repetition, he will say that the words metal and metal are phonemically distinct. This method is very doable when it comes to sign language. However, we don't really see any examples in a silent voice where the phonemes kind of clash like this. We do have the moment where Shoya gets confused at Shoko saying, I love the moon, because of the similar sound to I love you, and signs moon, but that's not the same thing. But if we go back to the hand shapes for apple and onion in ASL, we can consider it a kind of example of how phonemes might be hard to distinguish in a signed language. So if it works with ASL, it's likely to work with JSL. So when we're talking about terminal languages and finite languages and how they could potentially overlap, Chomsky shows that where English cannot be described by the finite process model, it can be described in terms of phrase structure. Each sentence of the language is represented by a set of strings, which leads to non-kernels. But additionally, we cannot put any string above another string. As he says, quote, there is no way of ordering the elements NP and VP relative to another. Thus, phrase structure must be considered a single level with a set of representations for each sentence of the language. There is a one-to-one correspondence between the properly chosen sets of representations and diagrams of the form. So essentially, take a JSL kernel sentence such as I am happy, which appears in a silent voice. From this, we would get every potential non-kernel sentence, but they would also all be at the same level of phrase structure. And additionally, there would be an issue of defining phoneme from morpheme. The importance of Chomsky's grammar is that he shows that certain sentences are related but also distinct, and we can only really see that with the way he presents language to us. Harris 2021 presents it this way. He poses two sentences. A, John is easy to please, and B, John is eager to please. To quote directly, these two sentences have the same apparent structure: a noun phrase, a copula, an adjective, and an infinitive verb. They even appear to have the same kind of functional relationship. They both predicate something about John and pleasing. But when you go deeper, you find important distinctions, specifically who is doing the pleasing and who is being pleased. Additionally, we gain insight into how human beings use and understand language. We gain a precise definition of the notion of grammatical relation, and we can see how the transformational process combines the grammatical relations of underlying simple sentences in complex sentences. Another important belief of Chomsky's, which I mentioned earlier, is that language acquisition is innate, meaning that children acquire language according to inherent knowledge of the elements of grammar. So there is a grammar that is innate. This, however, is not discussed in syntactic structures. In these pages, I have only touched on the complexity of Chomsky's ideas in the book. However, I think what I have relayed is enough to convey the general points. As a non-user of JSL, there is only so much I can do to analyze such syntax. I do, however, have a lofty hope that this episode inspires someone to analyze JSL using generative grammar. Thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope you learned something from it. Next time, we will be talking about aesthetics in Land of the Lustrous. Side note, I've been watching Chainsmoker Cat as it's been coming out, and there was a Land of the Lustrous joke in the episode 4. I assume that's because they're actually making a second season, but I thought that was funny. Well, that's all for now. Fuck Noam Chomsky. I I did not like this book at all.